Will waited at the factory with Davina and Stanley until the police arrived to take Professor Gelmet away. The police took Dr. Fugg, Hendrik Targ, and the two supervisors with him, and other officers came to talk to the children and work out what was to be done. By the time Will and the others got back to the academy, the police had arrived there as well. In the food area, officers were sitting with some of the children, asking them questions and recording their answers. At the end of one table sat Francis Morientes and Boris Galansky with a policewoman. Further along the table sat Grover Hicklethwaite and Charlotte Reedy with another. Bartholomew Jenkins was with a police officer in another part of the room. Davina grinned at him as they went past. Barnaby Krantz sighed. So much damage the professor caused. So much damage. Davina nodded. You wouldn't have thought anyone could have made Bart Simpson nastier, but the professor found a way. Mr. Krantz frowned. I mean those poor children, Davina. The ones he brainwashed in the factory. How much work will it take to put them right? He'll just have to use his helmets to reverse it, said Will. Someone will have to make sure that he does. Do you think he can? Asked Mr. Krantz hopefully. Maybe, said Will. They went through the ludarium. A pair of officers were trying to get order amongst a group of 6 or 7 children. Officers! Officers! I think I speak for everyone, Ermegild Zegner was saying in a loud voice. She does not! Benedict Goldberg and Morris Tuttelheim were shouting over her. The noise stopped when they caught sight of Will and the others. Silently, the children watched them go past. I suppose you could say the same about us as those kids in the old town, said Stanley, as the shouting started up again behind them. The helmets changed us, didn't they? Maybe the professor will have to put that right as well. Will frowned. He wondered about that. In his mind, there was still the question the professor had kept asking him. It wouldn't go away. Would he have done it? Would he have done all of this 3 months ago before he came to the academy, before he had ever gone under the helmet? Not me, said Davina. I'm not going under that helmet again. Forget it. I'd rather live in a shoe drawer like Bennett. Will grinned. Think about it first, Davina. Don't be so impetuous. Davina glared at him. I thought you liked the helmet sessions, said Mr. Krantz. You all used to love them. That was true, thought Will, but it was strange. He could remember the feeling of always wanting to have another session. He could remember the desire to go under the helmet, but right now he didn't want to. He wouldn't have done it even if he'd had the chance. It's like when you've had too much to eat of something you really love, Mr. Krantz, said Davina. It's ruined. You can't bear the thought of eating it again. Will nodded. Davina was right. That was exactly what it was like. The old man scratched his head and sighed again. Such damage, he said. Such damage. So you don't think this is the future after all, Mr. Krantz? Asked Will. No, I do, cried Mr. Krantz in despair. He threw up his hands. That's the problem. This is the future, Will, or something like it. If Professor Gelmet can invent such a thing, it's only a matter of time until someone else does, and someone else again. You can't hold something like this back, Will. It is the future, only not in the hands of Professor Gelmet. Somehow it has to be controlled. We have to learn how to use it properly without hurting anybody. We have to make sure it's used in the right way. Will thought about that. Perhaps Mr. Krantz was right, only it was hard to see how it could be done. I bet Miss Wilkins would give you a piece of your mind if she heard you say that, said Davina mischievously. It wouldn't be the first time, admitted Mr. Krantz. He chuckled. She's been giving me a piece of her mind for 60 years. Davina McCready grinned. That's because she's in love with you. Davina McCready! Exclaimed the old man, going as red as a beetroot. She is not in love with me. Davina glanced at Will and raised her eyebrows. Is she? Whispered Krantz. Do you think so? Only as much as Mr. Berger's in love with her. Davina McCready! Davina laughed with delight. Why did you go there anyway? Asked Mr. Krantz. You told me to, said Will. Tush, Will Buster, tush and tittle. That's not so. I didn't tell you to go there. When did I ever say such a thing? All those times, Mr. Krantz, all those times you told me about them, and where they meet, and when, and... The old man was staring at him blankly, utterly uncomprehending. You mean you weren't giving me a message? A message? You weren't telling me to go there secretly? You weren't to say I should... Mr. Krantz was laughing. So was Davina. Will stared at Mr. Krantz in disbelief. So, it was all a mistake? A misunderstanding, at least, said Davina. That's right, said the old housekeeper. A very fortunate misunderstanding. And he shook his head and looked at Will in amusement and began laughing again. Where's Stanley? Asked Davina. Will looked around. He was here just now. Mr. Krantz stopped laughing. He frowned. A look of concern came across his old face. I've got an idea where he might be. They found Stanley on the lawn outside the academy. He had one of Bennett's legs in his hands. I had to, said Stanley, and he couldn't go on. The tears were choking his voice. Of course, Stanley, said Mr. Krantz. Of course you had to. We'll help. They spread out over the lawn looking for bits of Bennett. Will found another leg, and Davina found his tail, and then Mr. Krantz found the bulk of his body, with 2 legs still attached, which must have been hurled away by someone, because it had ended up all the way across the lawn near the wall of the academy. Then they searched for his head. No one could find it, until they started looking under the trees at the edge of the forest. Mr. Krantz spotted it at the foot of a pine trunk, where it had rolled and come to rest with one eye open and one eye closed. He brought the head solemnly back to Stanley. Thank you, Mr. Krantz, whispered Stanley. He took Bennett's head and gently closed the eye that was open. He picked up all the pieces of the road dog. His arms were full. You know, Stanley, said Will, looking at the pieces in his arms, those bits don't look too badly damaged. They're not crushed or mashed up or anything. Will's right, said Davina. They look quite good, Stanley. His head's not smashed up like a green wibbler, for instance. You can't smash the head of a green wibbler, muttered Will. You can if you're Bart Simpson, whispered Davina. Do you really think so, guys? Stanley looked at them hopefully. Do you really think we can just... We can try, said Mr. Krantz. Do you think I should? If anyone can do it, you can, Stanley, said Davina. Now? Stanley, said Will, you don't ask a question like that with Davina around. No, Will. I think he should wait until Thursday. They all stared at her. Only joking. Come on, Stanley. What are you waiting for? The suspense is killing me. Stanley nodded seriously. All right. I'll try. Stanley sat down and laid the pieces of Bennett carefully on the grass. The others sat around him. Even Mr. Krantz lowered his creaky old body until he was cross-legged on the lawn. One of Bennett's legs was broken and couldn't be inserted. Stanley connected the other free leg. He connected the tail. But all of that was easy. The really critical part was still to come. Stanley held the dog's head in his hand. He examined the neck, checking the interface panel where it connected to the body. He checked the corresponding panel on the neck side of the body as well. He wiped them clean and examined them again and carefully blew away any last specks of dust. Still, he held Bennett's head in his hand, staring at it. Is something wrong? Asked Will. Stanley shook his head. What is it? Well, it's just, what if he doesn't work? What if the program doesn't work? Or if it's been damaged? You can only try, said Mr. Krantz encouragingly. But I mean, what if he's changed? Like us, said Davina, and she grinned mischievously. Go on, Stanley, said Will. Yes, go on, said Davina. Really? Slowly, carefully, Stanley brought the interface panels of the neck together. He clicked on the joint mechanism and into place. Gently, he rolled the neck around to check that the joint was undamaged. Then he brought the skin edges of the pieces together and sealed them. The edges were torn in a couple of places, but not severely. Finally, he smoothed the fur down, concealing the join. And now Bennett stood once more before them, minus one leg. But this wasn't the first time that had happened. His head drooped, eyes closed, tilted to one side. Stanley pulled a control pallet out of his pocket. He worked at the finger pads. Everyone watched the 3-legged dog on the grass in front of them. Nothing happened. No, said Stanley at last. He put down the pallet and shook his head. See, he's not... Bennett's head twitched. His eyes opened. He looked around first to one side, then the other. He peered at Will. He sniffed craftily. Then he began to grin. Will knew that look. Oh no, Stanley, he's gonna... Bennett leapt, lapping at Will's face with his big, sloppy tongue. "Bennett!" cried Stanley. "Bennett!" cried Davina. Mr. Krantz almost keeled over with laughter. Will thrashed his arms. Bennett bounced around and licked at super speed. Finally, Stanley got a hold of him. Bennett panted, nodding, grinning madly. "Bennett!" said Stanley sternly. Bennett looked up, tilting his head innocently, twitching his nose. Will wiped his face. "I'm telling you, Stanley, you're going to have to reprogram that dog."
Thanks so much for joining us for the very, very end of Will Buster and the Gelmet Album by Otto Hurst.